Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever considered what happens when academic knowledge, steps out of its comfortable ivory tower and plunges into the messy, complicated world of real life problems? How do we actually use what we've learned about human societies to help people without inadvertently causing more harm?
That's a profound challenge, isn't it? When we study cultures, we often focus on observation and analysis, right? But what's truly fascinating here is the active role anthropology can play, or sometimes consciously choose not to play, in shaping outcomes for communities facing these immense changes.
Precisely. And that's really our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into the dynamic world of applied anthropology, drawing insights directly from the chapter Human Societies. A brief introduction. We'll explore how anthropological knowledge is put into practice, the ethical tightropes involved, and the powerful, sometimes really surprising impacts it has on real communities. We'll unpack three distinct approaches to applying anthropology, and then get into some critical transnational issues like migration, violence, and the ongoing fight against colonialism. So yeah, get ready for a shortcut to being well informed on a topic that truly matters. So let's start with a foundational understanding. What exactly is applied anthropology?
Essentially, applied anthropology is the direct application of anthropological knowledge to real-world issues. It's about solving practical problems, advocating for societies or groups who might have little voice, and even helping to shape governmental policies. Historically, it often meant advising governments on programs of directed cultural change. But looking at its broader trajectory, its scope is significantly expanded. Ideally, it now involves close collaboration and solidarity with indigenous societies, moving away from those more colonial approaches of the past.
Okay, so this brings us to a crucial ethical question then. If anthropology ideally strives to be non-judgmental, accepting of all cultural practices, when do we as anthropologists actually have the right to intervene? Where do we draw the line? Who decides?
This poses a truly profound ethical dilemma,
Hmm.
a very deep one. We can maybe draw an analogy to a physician's Hippocratic oath. First, do no harm. Yet if a patient is in serious danger, a doctor have to intervene, or a good Samaritan would step in to save a life. So this begs the question, when should anthropologists intervene in a society that's, well, in danger? Should we adopt something like a prime directive of non-interference, like in science fiction? Our source material tells us there's just no easy answer.
So, with these ethical questions swirling around, how do anthropologists actually approach applying their knowledge? Our sources lay out three basic approaches: the detached, project specific, and proactive approaches. Let's maybe start with the detached approach. This might seem a bit counterintuitive because it's simply deciding not to do any applied anthropology at all.
That's right. The argument here is essentially that while we know some things about other societies, we don't yet know enough to make truly sound decisions about intervention. Practitioners, often academics, they suggest we need more foundational research, need to learn from others' attempts before we can responsibly step in. Maybe someday, but perhaps not today.
But the chapter also notes that this view isn't really widely held anymore. Many anthropologists feel compelled to act now, as traditional societies are being impacted right at this moment. So, even within this detached approach, are there still valuable contributions being made?
Oh, absolutely. It involves what's called archiving traditional culture through basic ethnographic studies. Think interviews, video recordings, sound recordings of narratives and music, mapping cultural landscapes.
Hmm.
This creates vital raw material for future research. It offers insights for intervention strategies down the line, especially concerning impacts from, say, globalization and colonization.
Okay. Next up, we have the project-specific approach, which it seems is the most common way anthropologists get involved.
Exactly. The idea here is that whether anthropologists are involved or not, various projects will impact societies. Development happens. So the thinking goes, it's better to do what we can to mitigate the impacts rather than just do nothing at all. Mistakes might happen, yeah, but the hope is that some good will come from the effort.
And this often sounds like it's mandated by governments, right? Like legally required sometimes.
It often is. For instance, if a project is going to impact Native groups here in the U.S. or elsewhere, anthropologists are hired to work with them, identify potential impacts, and propose mitigation measures. Now, while the developer, be it government or a private company, usually pays for this work, the anthropologist's role is always supposed to be advocating for the interests of the impacted groups.
That sounds like it could create some ethical challenges right there, balancing that academic objectivity with active advocacy.
It absolutely can. It's a constant tension.
And we see this in the US with what's called cultural resource management, or CRM. Is that a big part of this?
Yes, a significant amount of anthropology and especially archaeology in the U.S. falls under CRM. If a new dam, for example, or a highway will affect archaeological sites or contemporary Native American groups, laws require a study of potential impacts. Most archaeology today in the U.S. is actually CRM-based. Beyond this, you have forensic anthropologists assisting in criminal cases or investigating genocides, and cultural anthropologists have even been hired by the military sometimes, like to help with relationships with other societies in places like Afghanistan.
Now, our source material highlights a really crucial shift in how anthropologists engage with affected societies. It talks about moving from simply having informants to truly involving consultants. What's the significance of that distinction?
Yeah, that's a key point in, well, decolonizing anthropology, really. Historically, early anthropologists often gathered information without deep consultation. They observed, they asked questions, but didn't necessarily involve people in the analysis or decisions.
I see.
Now, the term consultants signifies a shift. These individuals are actively involved, they're given opportunities to participate in the studies, have their views properly voiced, particularly when decisions about their future are being made, often by governmental agencies. Anthropologists really strive now to consult on all potential impacts and any proposed mitigation measures.
But that tension you mentioned earlier between objectivity and advocacy still exists.
It does. Project-specific anthropologists often remain neutral on the final decisions made by the agencies, providing the information so those agencies can make informed choices. Though, of course, legal avenues exist if truly poor decisions are made.
Right. Okay, so to bring this to life, our source material provides a really stark illustration. It talks about forced resettlement due to large infrastructure projects specifically, looking at the construction of two massive dams.
Yes, this is a powerful example. Resettlement, that's the term used, but it means being forced to abandon your home and move elsewhere. We're talking about huge numbers. Global estimates suggest over 200 million people could be displaced by infrastructure projects in the coming decades, plus tens of millions more due to, well, climate change migration.
Wow.
These projects, especially large dams, they flood vast areas of land, displace huge numbers of people, damage or destroy archaeological sites, and alter entire ecosystems. It's profound disruption.
Let's look at the first case study, the Aswan High Dam on the Nile River in Egypt, built between 1960 and 1970. The goal seemed noble, right? Control flooding, boost agriculture.
Exactly. The goal was to control the annual, often devastating flooding of the Nile for more predictable and productive agriculture. But the result was this huge 310-mile-long reservoir. It's known as Lake Nasser in Egypt and Lake Nubia in Sudan. And it flooded the homes of about 100,000 people, many of them Nubian communities, and countless archaeological sites went underwater.
And the chapter mentioned this wasn't even the first time for some of these Nubian communities.
That's right. The earlier Aswan Low Dam had already caused relocations. So the Egyptian government's program this time to relocate Nubian communities to higher ground was just fraught with problems. Many promises of adequate land and compensation just went unfulfilled. Despite some Nubians having prior experience with relocating, the process was incredibly stressful. People lost homes, farms, their traditional livelihoods. Malnutrition and disease were apparently quite prevalent in the resettlement camps initially.
Were there any eventual upsides, or was it all negative?
Well, the source does mention some eventual improvements. For instance, men were able to stay home more rather than migrating for work, and there was perhaps increased integration into Egyptian society over time. But the initial human cost was undeniably immense.
What about those iconic archaeological sites? You mentioned many were flooded.
That's another fascinating layer. An international program, co-sponsored by UNESCO, launched a truly remarkable effort to save some of the most significant ancient Egyptian temples. They were moved to higher ground or even to museums abroad. The most famous example is the complex at Abu Simbel, dating from Ramesses II.
Right, those huge statues cut into the cliffs.
Exactly. These massive temples were meticulously mapped, then cut into thousands of blocks weighing tons each, and then painstakingly reassembled on higher ground. And they did it so precisely that they maintained their original alignment, so the sun's rays would still penetrate the inner sanctuary at specific times of the year, just as they were designed to thousands of years ago. It's an incredible testament to engineering and preservation efforts.
But the chapter also touches on wider environmental issues too, right? Degradation of agriculture, downstream, fisheries.
Yes, and even current geopolitical tensions because of other dams being built upstream now, like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The impacts ripple outwards.
Okay, then there's the other major example. the monumental Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River in China, completed in 2006. Huge scale.
Absolutely massive. It's 1.4 miles long, created a 410-mile reservoir built primarily for hydroelectric power and flood protection, which is crucial in a region where floods have historically killed millions.
But it also carries immense risks, doesn't it? The chapter mentions concerns about its stability.
It does. If it were to fail, something like 400 million people downstream would be in danger, and there have been concerns reported about the dam actually deforming under the immense pressure. Environmentally, many species went extinct or became endangered. Deforestation in the area has exacerbated erosion, causing the reservoir itself to start silting in, which reduces its capacity.
And the human cost. How many people were relocated for this one?
The government relocated about 1.1 million people from roughly 1,500 cities and villages. Many rural farmers were forced into urban settings. Their traditional villages were bulldozed. This caused major trauma, especially in a society that deeply reveres ancestors, as temples, sacred places, even cemeteries were abandoned or destroyed.
What about the long-term socioeconomic effects on those resettled communities? Did things improve eventually, like with Aswan?
Well, initial studies showed significant declines in income and livelihoods, as you might expect. However, follow-up studies, mentioned from 2011 and 2018, did indicate improvements over time. Things like less income inequality, more secure food sources, and increased overall well-being were reported later on.
But what's the key lesson here?
A crucial takeaway seems to be that access to land remains absolutely central for rural households to adapt effectively and rebuild their lives after such disruption. It really makes you question the true cost of progress, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Okay, let's move to our third approach, the proactive approach. This is where anthropologists aren't just mitigating impacts, but actively seeking to implement changes they believe are beneficial, or maybe stopping practices they view as harmful.
Exactly. And this approach often puts them in direct conflict with governments whose policies they might be challenging. They tend to work directly with and advocate strongly for indigenous societies. But this, again, brings up those profound ethical questions. Who decides what needs to change? When? How? What about the wishes of the affected society itself? And how does this square with that traditional anthropological philosophy of cultural relativism, the idea that we should understand practices within their own cultural context without imposing outside judgment?
Where do you draw the line? I mean, the chapter mentions things like funerary practices, maybe finger cutting or eating certain foods, versus more critical issues like human rights violations or even genocide.
The chapter suggests intervention seems most warranted when lives are clearly at stake, but acknowledges it's rarely simple. For example, in the Amazon, anthropologists have worked for decades with indigenous groups to help protect their lands and their intellectual property rights. This has led to some lands being set aside as preserves, which is a positive outcome.
But that work can be dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. The chapter notes that activists involved in this kind of work are sometimes murdered, often by agents working for multinational corporations who want those resources.
And the chapter also gives us that fantastic example of a fix that went totally wrong in Bali, Indonesia, the irrigation system.
Yes, a classic cautionary tale. The World Bank tried to fix the traditional Balinese irrigation system for rice paddies using sophisticated computer technology. Sounds modern, efficient, right? But the existing system was incredibly complex and effective. It was managed by a complex priesthood, with the Jero Gree, the high priest, understanding the overall water flow and ecology, and subordinate priests managing water distribution downstream. This intricate timed system prevented water waste and also controlled pests naturally. The World Bank's intervention, it was disastrous.
What happened?
It caused water shortages in some areas, floods in others, massive insect outbreaks because the coordinated fallow periods were disrupted, and ultimately food shortages. Control was quickly returned to the Jero Greed and the traditional system.
A very clear case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Absolutely. It perfectly illustrates the potential pitfalls of well-intentioned but culturally uninformed intervention.
And then there's the highly contentious issue also mentioned, female circumcision, often referred to as female genital cutting or FGM.
Yes. This is presented as an example where some anthropologists, alongside international groups like the UN, decide that a traditional custom is fundamentally harmful and attempt to stop it. The practice, which occurs in many different societies across Africa and parts of the Middle East and Asia, typically involves the surgical removal of the clitoris, sometimes other parts of the genitalia. Reasons given often relate to reducing female sexual desire, ensuring chastity, or validating a woman's female identity within her culture.
But the dangers are significant.
Extremely. The danger often lies in the unsafe surgery itself, frequently performed by traditional practitioners, maybe with unsterilized tools like razor blades. This can lead to severe blood loss, infection, chronic pain, infertility, complications in childbirth, and even death. Yet many older women who underwent this defend it strongly as a vital cultural tradition. Critics of intervention, on the other hand, sometimes view the attempt to ban it as a form of colonial interference, especially when loaded terms like mutilation are used by outsiders.
So it's a really complex ethical dilemma right at the heart of the proactive approach's challenges.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates the deep tensions between respecting cultural practices and intervening to prevent perceived harm, especially when there isn't universal agreement within the culture itself.
Okay, moving beyond these specific approaches, our source material also highlights broader transnational issues. These are cross-border challenges often linked to globalism. They impact people's nationality, citizenship, identity, decision-making. We're talking about large numbers of displaced people becoming refugees or migrants.
Indeed. And while we might think of historical colonialism as something in the past, the chapter points out that it effectively continues in many places, often driven now by transnational corporations seeking resources, sometimes with complicit governments, forcing what are termed fourth world people. These are often indigenous or tribal communities marginalized within larger nation-states from their traditional lands.
And the result?
The result is that survivors often become refugees or are forced into subservient marginalized groups within the dominant society. We also see massive internal migration within countries like in China or parts of Africa where people move from rural areas to urban settings seeking work. This strains city resources and disrupts demographics significantly.
And climate change is a huge driver now, too.
Increasingly so. Climate change is pushing more and more people to move as droughts, floods, or rising sea levels make their homes uninhabitable. This creates massive transnational problems when these people cross borders. It all raises a really important question. How do we ensure the basic human rights of all these displaced and migrating people?
The sources then focus specifically on the crises of migrants and refugees. In the U.S., for example, the chapter notes that anti-immigration sentiment has a long, unfortunately ugly history.
Yes, from being anti-Irish in the 19th century to anti-Chinese, and more recently often anti-Hispanic or anti-Muslim. The chapter suggests this often stems from fears among the dominant group of losing power, or sometimes just from outright racism.
And ironically, past immigrant communities often integrate and then sometimes become anti-immigrant themselves later on.
That pattern has certainly been observed. And while legal immigration numbers are generally controlled by governments, the movement of unauthorized migrants and refugees is a much larger, more complex global issue. It fuels nationalist populist movements worldwide.
So what's the core distinction the chapter makes between a migrant and a refugee?
Okay, so the source clarifies that migrants generally make a deliberate, often one-way passage to a new environment, frequently crossing national boundaries. They are typically seeking a better life, economic opportunities, maybe joining family. If it's done legally, they're termed immigrants. If it's done without authorization, they're often called migrants, though the chapter makes a point of stressing that nobody should be illegal as a human being. They often move in groups for safety or shared resources.
And refugees.
Refugees, on the other hand, are defined as people displaced primarily by war, violence, persecution, and now, increasingly, by climate change. They are fundamentally trying to stay alive, to find safety.
Though both might end up seeking asylum.
Exactly. Both migrants and refugees might become asylum seekers once they reach a potential host country, attempting to gain legal status and protection. And the chapter outlines 5 key aspects influencing migrant movements: the structure and scale, how many, who, their motivations, why move, the impact on communities, origin, transit, target, the distance and boundaries crossed, and the mode of travel. Each shapes the experience.
And the dangers involved are immense, right?
Absolutely. Migrants are exposed to crime, exploitation, often terrible treatment during transit, and frequently forced into clandestine, dangerous travel methods.
The chapter gives a striking example of how the U.S.-Mexico border has actually split the traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham people.
Yes, restricting their movement across their ancestral territory, reducing access to sacred sites, family members, even vital water sources. There's no easy resolution to that kind of division imposed by a political border.
And internal migration is significant, too, people moving within their own countries.
Very significant. As agriculture industrializes globally, rural populations often move to cities seeking work. We see this massively in China, but also across Africa and other regions. This strains urban resources, housing, sanitation, healthcare, and disrupts demographics. It can also lead to a decline in health for the migrants themselves due to disrupted social support networks and stressful living conditions.
Okay, now let's turn to Spotlight 14.2, which details the role of coyotes and cartels along the U.S. southern border. It paints a picture of a global human smuggling industry.
It really does. Coyotes, or poleros, are the smugglers. They charge hefty fees, often thousands of dollars, promising transport across borders. Interestingly, the chapter notes that their customers, the migrants, often report having relatively good relationships with their coyotes, seeing them as providing a necessary service despite the risks and costs.
And there's the migrant caravan strategy, too.
Yes, that's a different strategy, often formed by people who lack funds for coyotes, or sometimes for perceived safety in numbers. But what's fascinating, and perhaps counterintuitive, is that some research suggests caravan migrants might actually be more vulnerable to certain crimes, like robbery along the route, compared to those who employ coyotes for a more direct, albeit still dangerous, passage.
And the dangers don't end just with smugglers or criminals. The physical journey itself
Is incredibly perilous, especially through arid desert regions like those along the U.S.-Mexico border. The chapter mentions Good Samaritans who try to help by leaving caches of food and water.
But these efforts are sometimes thwarted.
Tragically, yes. The text states that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, or Border Patrol agents sometimes destroy these life-saving supplies. This contributes to many deaths from heat exposure and dehydration deaths that are often largely ignored or unrecorded, though forensic anthropologists sometimes get involved in identifying remains found in the desert.
And then there's the involvement of drug cartels.
That's perhaps the most disturbing element.
Hmm.
Drug cartels have deeply infiltrated the human smuggling business. They act essentially as corporate coyotes, controlling routes and charging fees. They even use migrants, sometimes involuntarily, as mules to carry drugs across the border. They also reportedly conscript local native people, like the Raramuri in Mexico, forcing them to act as drug runners. It highlights this really dangerous intersection of organized crime and human displacement.
Shifting back to refugees, then people displaced by war, violence, climate change.
We face numerous major refugee crises today. The chapter mentions Palestinians, Ukrainians, and the ongoing complex situation at the U.S. southern border involves many asylum seekers fleeing violence. And millions more are becoming climate refugees, as drought and floods ravage their homes and farms, particularly in vulnerable regions. This is a huge humanitarian issue, and it often destabilizes national governments struggling to cope with the influx.
The chapter also brings to light the issue of systematic violence against marginalized groups. Who falls into this category?
These are typically minority groups based on ethnicity, race, religion, sexual orientation. The chapter mentions LGBTQIA+ specifically, and also the urban poor. These groups consistently face discrimination, oppression, and often horrific violence.
And this violence can take many forms.
Yes, it can range from state-sponsored or state-condoned genocides, like the atrocities against the Tutsis in Rwanda or the ongoing persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar, to the targeted murder of political dissidents, the internment of specific groups in camps, and the global scourges of human trafficking and modern slavery. It really forces us to ask how societies treat their most vulnerable members.
And Spotlight 14.3 focuses on a particularly egregious issue in North America: missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW.
Yes, this is described as an epidemic of violence directed specifically against Indigenous women and two-spirits individuals who embody both male and female spiritual qualities in many Indigenous cultures across both Canada and the U.S. This has been ongoing for centuries, tragically, and largely ignored or minimized by the dominant societies. The chapter details horrifying statistics. For instance, in Canada, the murder rate for Native women is 6 times higher than for non-Native women. Some call this a form of ongoing genocide.
What factors contribute to this crisis?
Government reports cited in the text acknowledge that colonial attitudes, systemic racism, severe underreporting of cases, a lack of coordination between different law enforcement agencies, and fragmented legal jurisdictions on and off reserves all contribute significantly to this ongoing tragedy.
Is anything being done?
Thankfully, yes. Legislation in both Canada and the U.S. is finally starting to bring this issue to the forefront, mandating better data collection, interagency cooperation, and resources, though there's still a very long way to go.
The chapter also touches on how legal systems themselves can disproportionately impact marginalized people.
Absolutely. Minorities and the urban poor are far more likely to be arrested, charged, convicted, and incarcerated than members of dominant groups. The chapter highlights the staggering fact that the U.S. has nearly 2 million people in prison, a disproportionate number of whom are from marginalized communities. Another major transnational issue with profound cultural impacts discussed is the international illegal drug trade.
Right, a vast global enterprise.
Huge. It influences local and national economies, often negatively by distorting them. It leads to environmental degradation through things like deforestation for illicit crops. And it threatens the health and well-being, again, mostly of marginalized groups, both producers and consumers.
This whole network involves producers, shippers, distributors, money launderers, corrupt officials, creating this massive black economy. The chapter notes that fentanyl is currently the most dangerous drug.
Yes, primarily originating in China, often processed and trafficked through Mexico, and entering the U.S., accounting for, the text says, over 100,000 overdose deaths in the U.S. in 2023 alone. Staggering numbers.
And how does this tie back to local communities and the environment?
What's really relevant here is how these illegal activities, which also include things like illicit logging and wildlife trade, often conscript local people into participating, sometimes through coercion. It diverts labor and resources away from legal economies, often relies heavily on violence to maintain control, which creates more refugees and displaced people, and further degrades the environment through unsustainable practices. It's a truly vicious cycle.
Okay, finally, let's talk about countering colonialism. We often think of historical European suppression of indigenous societies, but the chapter makes it clear that colonialism is, in many ways, still very much underway.
That's a crucial point. It's ongoing, largely driven now by corporations seeking resources, minerals, timber, oil, agricultural land, often located on indigenous lands. And frequently, this happens with the complicity or active support of national governments.
So, countering this requires what?
The chapter suggests two major steps. First, ending this ongoing corporate colonialism. That means fundamental changes in how globalization operates and how corporations are regulated, especially internationally. A truly formidable task, obviously. Second, reversing the effects of historical colonialism. This involves the process of decolonization and, importantly, also involves anthropology critically examining its own historical role in the colonial process.
Before European contact, indigenous groups were generally sovereign, right? Independent, self-governing.
Yes, sovereign, meaning they were independent political entities with the ability to govern themselves and control their own territories and resources. But through colonization, they systematically lost their sovereignty, their land, often vast numbers lost their lives, and face immense pressure to give up their cultural identities.
So regaining sovereignty is really at the heart of decolonization efforts.
Exactly. Sovereignty, in this context, encompasses a wide range of rights: regaining control over land and water, ensuring religious freedom, revitalizing cultural identity and language, having control over their own cultural heritage, like artifacts or ancestral remains, ensuring security for their communities, and regaining ownership or control of natural resources on their lands.
Is full independence a realistic goal for most groups?
The chapter suggests that full political independence, becoming separate nation-states, might be a bridge too far, or perhaps not even desired by many indigenous groups currently living within existing countries. However, it gives some powerful examples where steps towards greater autonomy or even independence are being taken. Greenland's Inuit Atquitejit Party is actively moving towards independence from Denmark. The Mohawk Nation in the U.S. issues its own passports based on treaty rights from 1794, asserting a form of sovereignty.
And in Canada.
The creation of Nunavut in 1999 granted significant self-determination to the Inuit in a vast territory within Canada. Even less ambitious efforts at self-determination have seen success in places like Australia, Canada, and the U.S. Many groups have gained recognized land bases, achieved greater political autonomy, and established more control over local affairs like education and healthcare, though they often remain dependent on national governments for funding and operate within the larger state's legal framework.
But it's not happening everywhere.
No, sadly. The chapter notes that in places like Brazil, for instance, colonialism, particularly driven by agribusiness and resource extraction in the Amazon, continues largely unabated, with devastating consequences for indigenous peoples.
And climate change throws another huge challenge into this mix.
A disproportionate one. Indigenous societies, especially those maintaining traditional lifestyles closely tied to specific environments, are often the hardest hit by climate change, impacts disappearing forests, prolonged droughts, rising sea levels, flooding coastal or island homes, dwindling populations of traditional food sources like fish or game. And they generally have no control over the global industrial activities causing climate change, yet suffer its worst consequences.
This leads us nicely into the final spotlight. Spotlight 14.4, Peace Out, or Return to the Land, which highlights Indigenous peoples actively regaining their lands and traditional lifestyles. Let's start with Indigenous Australians.
Right. In Australia, after colonization, Indigenous people were forcibly removed from their lands, confined to reserves, or forced to work on ranches, leading to massive cultural loss and social problems. But starting in the 1970s, partly due to gaining citizenship rights, and partly out of deep disenchantment with life in the government settlements or towns, many Aboriginal people began what's called the outstation movement.
What did that involve?
It involved families and small groups moving back out to their traditional ancestral lands, often in remote areas, to reestablish smaller, decentralized communities. They aim to readopt traditional lifestyles as much as possible, focusing on traditional foods, bush tucker, using traditional knowledge and technologies alongside some modern ones, and revitalizing traditional religious practices and social structures.
And what were the results?
These small communities, often just 25, 35 people, generally experience significantly improved morale and well-being. They often banned alcohol, which had become a major problem in the larger settlements. And they found they could interact with the wider Australian society on a more equal footing, from a position of strength rooted in their own land and culture. It's described as a powerful example of a revitalization movement, demonstrating their resilience and ability to thrive in ways they had for, well, some 60,000 years prior to colonization.
And a similar story, but different context, for the Inuit in the Canadian Arctic.
Yes, for thousands of years, the Inuit thrived across the Arctic through sophisticated hunting techniques adapted to that extreme environment. But starting in the 1600s, the European, particularly French, fur trade dramatically altered their lives. They gradually shifted focus from hunting primarily for food and subsistence to hunting animals like foxes and seals for their pelts to trade for Western goods.
Which eroded traditional skills.
It did, and led to the adoption of Western technologies like guns and eventually snowmobiles, which made them more dependent on outside resources like fuel and ammunition. Many Inuit also moved into permanent settlements around trading posts. These settlements often brought negative consequences, increased violence, exposure to new diseases, problems with alcohol abuse.
So when the fur trade declined,
When the fur trade declined sharply in the 1950s, many Inuit men found themselves unemployed and disconnected from their traditional skills and way of life. As a response, the chapter describes how some Inuit families made a conscious choice to move away from the trading post towns. They thought to readopt their traditional mobile hunting lifestyle, using dog sleds again, and largely severing ties with the Canadian government and dependence on Western goods.
was that easy?
No, it was undoubtedly challenging, partly because some traditional skills have been lost over generations. But it represents this deep yearning for a return to traditional ways, self-sufficiency, and autonomy on the land.
So decolonization is clearly this ongoing complex endeavor, but progress is being made as various groups regain some level of sovereignty, even if there's still clearly a great deal left to do.
Wow, what an incredibly rich and frankly challenging deep dive into how anthropological insights interact with some of the world's most pressing issues. It really makes you think about the responsibility that comes with knowledge, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of discovery today. It truly does. And perhaps connecting this to the bigger picture, this deep dive really raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. As societies continue to face these unprecedented global challenges, climate change, mass migration, ongoing inequality, how can the lessons we've discussed from applied anthropology best inform a future where intervention, when it happens, is both effective and ethically responsible? How can it truly empower the communities it seeks to serve, rather than imposing outside solutions?
That's a powerful thought to carry forward. We really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of applied anthropology and perhaps sparked your own curiosity to explore these vital topics further. Until next time, keep digging.